He had an excavation machine dig open Thor's grave. Deep inside that dark cave, he discovered the legendary Bifrost from Norse mythology. Every piece of evidence pointed toward only one conclusion: the stories of Thor were real. He stepped into the underground tomb. In the center of the chamber, he noticed a massive stone coffin. Inside it were a belt, a glove, and Thor's hammer. He put on the belt and the glove before lifting the hammer. Instantly, the electricity in the air began rushing toward it. Within seconds, dark storm clouds covered the entire farm, and a tremendous bolt of lightning crashed down from the sky. But the lightning did not harm him at all. The hammer absorbed its immense power completely. This weapon was not only protecting him, but it was also helping him control the power of the gods that now existed within him. When he walked out of the tomb, he saw that a huge crowd had gathered all around the farm. However, none of them had the slightest idea that a sniper was watching their every move from a distant hill. The forces backing that female agent had no intention of letting anyone with godlike powers stay alive. Without warning, a bullet came flying straight toward him. But the sniper's aim was terribly off. When he looked over and saw his girlfriend lying on the ground, he was completely shattered. His divine power could make someone's heart beat again, but it could not heal a bullet wound to the brain. His face turned completely emotionless. He put on the glove and summoned the hammer back into his hand. The moment it returned, dark storm clouds swallowed the entire farm. The sniper tried to fire another shot, but the bullet melted in midair before it could reach him. He hurled the hammer into the raging storm clouds. Countless bolts of lightning tore across the sky as the hammer became so intensely hot that it glowed bright red. When it finally returned to his hand, the end of the world had already begun. No one could stand against a god consumed by such overwhelming rage. No one ever learned how many people died in the destruction that followed. The story begins deep inside a dense forest in Norway, where an American man named Eric has been living completely alone in hiding. His life has become a constant struggle for survival, as he has neither enough money nor enough food to sustain himself. Every day is a battle against hunger, isolation, and uncertainty. Although it may seem that he has chosen this lonely existence, the truth is very different. Eric came all the way to Norway with only one purpose: to find his family. Unfortunately, despite all his efforts and countless days of searching, he has not been able to discover even the smallest clue about where they are or what happened to them. One night, while sleeping inside his small tent in the middle of the forest, Eric experiences a horrifying dream that feels disturbingly real. In the dream, every tree surrounding his tent suddenly bursts into flames without any warning. The fire spreads rapidly from one tree to another until the entire forest is engulfed in blazing flames. Within moments, everything is reduced to black ashes, leaving behind nothing but destruction and silence. The nightmare is so terrifying that Eric suddenly wakes up in a panic, breathing heavily as he tries to realize whether what he witnessed was real or only a dream. Even though such visions would frighten most people, Eric does not react with much surprise because strange and disturbing dreams like these have become a regular part of his life. He has no idea why they keep happening or what they actually mean, but after experiencing them so many times, he has simply learned to ignore them and continue living as if nothing happened. As time passes, Eric's condition continues to worsen because one of his legs has been severely burned, and the injury has become increasingly painful. Realizing that he cannot survive much longer without treatment, he finally decides to leave the safety of the forest and head toward the nearest town in search of medicine. Since he has no money to pay for medical supplies, he quietly sneaks into a local clinic without attracting anyone's attention. Carefully avoiding the staff, he manages to steal the medicine he desperately needs before slipping into one of the clinic's bathrooms. Inside, he calmly applies the ointment to his badly burned leg, hoping it will ease the pain and prevent the wound from becoming even worse. Knowing that his long hair and thick beard make him easier to recognize, he also cuts both of them in an attempt to change his appearance. Once he finishes treating himself and altering his look, Eric wastes no time and quickly leaves the clinic before anyone notices what he has done. With the stolen medicine in his possession, Eric begins making his way back toward the forest, believing the worst part of the day is finally over. However, while walking along a lonely forest path, he suddenly encounters a group of mischievous local boys. Instead of letting him pass peacefully, the boys surround him and begin mocking and harassing him simply for their own amusement. Among them is a boy named Ole, who is far more aggressive than the others. Without any hesitation, Ole forcefully shoves Eric, causing him to stumble. The unexpected attack instantly fills Eric with anger, but instead of fighting back immediately, he gives Ole a serious warning. Looking directly at him, Eric tells him that if he dares to touch him again, he will burn to death right there. Neither Ole nor the other boys take Eric's warning seriously. Believing that Eric is simply trying to scare them, Ole laughs at him and walks closer without the slightest fear. Then, ignoring every warning he has just received, Ole grabs Eric by the collar. However, the very next moment, something completely unimaginable happens. Without any visible reason or explanation, Ole suddenly collapses onto the ground. Before anyone can even understand what is happening, he dies right there on the spot. The shocking incident leaves everyone around him frozen with fear and confusion because no one can explain how a perfectly healthy boy could suddenly lose his life just seconds after touching Eric. The mysterious death quickly draws the attention of the authorities, and before long, the police arrive at the scene. Since Eric was the last person involved with Ole before his sudden death, they immediately arrest him on suspicion of murder. Eric is taken into police custody, where investigators begin questioning him in the hope of uncovering the truth behind the bizarre incident. However, despite all their efforts, Eric refuses to answer even a single question. He remains completely silent throughout the interrogation, offering no explanation, no defense, and no information that might help the investigation. His unusual behavior only makes the police even more suspicious, leaving them convinced that he is hiding something important. Unable to make any progress through ordinary questioning, the investigators eventually decide to seek professional help. Believing that Eric's silence may have a psychological reason, they call in a psychologist named Christine, hoping that she will be able to gain his trust and persuade him to reveal the truth behind the mysterious events. Eventually, after remaining silent for so long, Eric finally decided to speak to Christine. Looking at her with complete sincerity, he insisted that he had not killed Ole. According to Eric, he had even warned the boy to stay away from him because he feared something terrible might happen if Ole touched him again. He explained that whatever happened after that warning was completely beyond his control. Eric claimed that he had never intended for Ole to die and that the tragic incident was not something he had consciously caused. While Eric and Christine were having this conversation inside the interrogation room, a police officer named Henrik was secretly listening to every single word from another room. Despite hearing Eric's explanation, Henrik refused to believe any of it. To him, the mysterious American sounded like nothing more than a dangerous criminal trying to invent unbelievable excuses to escape responsibility for murder. Nevertheless, Christine continued speaking with Eric instead of dismissing his claims, believing that there was still much more to his story than anyone realized. As the conversation grew deeper, Christine uncovered a shocking piece of Eric's past. She learned that 3 years earlier, a devastating fire had broken out on a farm, and according to the investigation, Eric had somehow been connected to that incident as well. The fire had been so destructive that nearly 5 people had lost their lives. This disturbing discovery immediately raised even more questions because it suggested that Ole's mysterious death might not have been an isolated event. While continuing to answer Christine's questions, Eric revealed another important detail about himself. He explained that his family had lived in the north for several generations and that his ancestors had deep roots in that region. As Christine carefully listened to everything he was saying, she realized that treating him like a dangerous criminal was only making him withdraw further into himself. Hoping to earn his trust, she made a bold decision and removed his handcuffs. Christine believed that if Eric felt he was finally speaking to someone who genuinely wanted to understand him instead of simply accusing him, he might be willing to reveal the complete truth. Her decision proved to be the right one because, after a long silence, Eric finally opened up. It was revealed that the 5 people who had died in the massive fire 3 years earlier were not strangers at all. They were actually Eric's own relatives. As Christine spoke the names of his family members, painful memories came rushing back into Eric's mind. His face filled with grief, guilt, and unbearable regret as he remembered the tragedy that had destroyed his entire family. Unable to carry the burden any longer, Eric finally broke down and admitted that he was responsible not only for the deaths of his relatives but also for Ole's death. Even though he had never intended to kill anyone, he accepted that these terrible tragedies had happened because of him. As Eric continued revealing the painful truth, something incredibly strange began happening inside the interrogation room. Without any wind blowing, Christine suddenly noticed that her hair had started floating in the air all by itself. Before she could even understand what was happening, Eric demonstrated the mysterious abilities he had been trying so desperately to hide. Right in front of her eyes, he lifted water out of a nearby dead body without physically touching it. The impossible sight confirmed that Eric possessed supernatural powers unlike anything she had ever imagined. However, Eric's demonstration quickly took a terrifying turn because, just as he had warned before, he was unable to control his abilities once his emotions became unstable. As his feelings intensified, the supernatural energy around him spiraled out of control. Within moments, powerful bolts of lightning began striking throughout the building, and those lightning strikes soon ignited a massive fire that rapidly spread through the facility. Panic instantly erupted as alarms sounded and people rushed to escape the growing flames. Watching everything unfold, Christine finally understood what no one else had realized. She recognized that Eric's extraordinary powers were directly connected to his emotional state. Whenever he became overwhelmed by fear, grief, anger, or guilt, guilt, his abilities reacted on their own and became dangerously uncontrollable. Realizing that trying to fight him would only make the situation worse, Christine focused entirely on calming him down. She spoke to him gently, urging him to control his emotions and reminding him that he still had the strength to regain control over his powers before even more innocent people were hurt. Not long after the incident, officials from the U.S. Embassy arrived in Norway to take custody of Eric and transport him back to the United States. Among them was an officer named Hathaway, who immediately attempted to question Eric in hopes of learning the truth about his mysterious abilities. However, Eric refused to cooperate with anyone except Christine. No matter what Hathaway asked him, Eric remained silent and made it clear that Christine was the only person he was willing to trust. Before being escorted onto the helicopter, Eric made an unusual request. Knowing how dangerous his powers could become if he lost control, he asked Hathaway to inject him with a powerful sedative so that he would remain unconscious during the journey. Hathaway agreed to the request, believing it was the safest way to transport him. Soon after receiving the injection, Eric lost consciousness, and the officers secured him before the helicopter took off for America. As the helicopter continued flying over the sea, the effects of the sedative gradually began wearing off. Eric slowly regained consciousness and immediately realized that, while he had been unconscious, the officers had tied him up to prevent any chance of escape. Feeling betrayed and believing that his trust had once again been abused, Eric became overwhelmed with anger. He desperately struggled against the restraints, trying with all his strength to break free from the ropes holding him down. The moment his emotions spiraled out of control, nature itself seemed to respond. Dark storm clouds rapidly gathered across the sky, covering the bright daylight in thick layers of black cloud. As Eric continued struggling, the storm became increasingly violent. Powerful winds shook the helicopter from every direction while thunder echoed across the sky and lightning flashed around the aircraft. The weather grew so extreme that the pilots completely lost control. Within moments, the helicopter was thrown into chaos before finally crashing violently into the sea below. After sinking beneath the water, Eric expected to drown like any ordinary person. Instead, he made an astonishing discovery. To his complete surprise, he realized that he could breathe underwater without any difficulty. Understanding that his mysterious powers extended far beyond what he had imagined, Eric finally allowed his anger to fade away. Once he regained control of his emotions, his first instinct was not to escape but to save the people around him. Seeing Hathaway unconscious in the water, Eric pulled him all the way to the shore and rescued his life. However, before Hathaway regained consciousness and realized what had happened, Eric quietly disappeared from the scene. Meanwhile, when Ole's father, John, learned that Eric's helicopter had crashed but that Eric had still survived, he immediately told the police to capture him. John's heart was burning with the desire to avenge his son's death, so he decided that he would personally kill Eric. On the other hand, Eric somehow managed to escape and reach Christine, asking her for help. Christine felt sorry for Eric after seeing the condition he was in, so she took him to a friend's house. There, Eric finally told her everything from the very beginning. He explained how, one day, mysterious magical powers suddenly awakened inside him, causing a massive fire to erupt all around him. Unable to control himself, he accidentally caused the deaths of many people. He then showed Christine all the wounds covering his body and explained that every time he used his powers, his own body was injured as well. Because of these abilities, he tried to stay as far away from other people as possible so that no one else would be harmed because of him. After that, Eric fell asleep, and Christine noticed that the trees and plants surrounding him were growing at an incredibly fast rate. Meanwhile, Hathaway somehow managed to reach a hospital, where she informed the police that Eric had the power to control the weather. She claimed that he had deliberately caused the helicopter to crash so that he could escape alive. At the same time, Christine wanted to learn more about Eric's mysterious powers, so she decided to take him back to the same farm where everything had originally begun. Meanwhile, the police declared both Eric and Christine as fugitives. They set up roadblocks on several highways and began checking every vehicle passing through. When Christine noticed one of the checkpoints, she turned the car onto another road. However, she was unable to stop the vehicle before it came face to face with a truck. At that very moment, Eric became extremely frightened, causing powerful waves of electricity to burst out of his body. Their car immediately broke down. Despite everything, the kind truck driver offered both of them a ride. Soon afterward, Hathaway and Henrik found Christine's abandoned car on the roadside and immediately realized where the two of them were heading. They decided to capture Eric and Christine at the Hardanger Bridge. When Eric and Christine arrived at the bridge, they saw that the police were already waiting for them. Left with no other choice, Eric decided to surrender himself peacefully. He walked to the middle of the bridge and quietly stood there. But just then, Christine tried to save him and one of the police officers injured her. Seeing this, Eric was consumed with rage and despite not wanting to, his powers unleashed a violent storm. Christine somehow managed to calm him down and urged him to control himself so that no one around him would get hurt. Eric then gathered all the surrounding electricity around himself, and eventually collapsed unconscious. Henrik and everyone else present were left completely stunned after witnessing the incredible extent of Eric's power. Henrik finally realized that perhaps Eric was not a bad person after all. He approached Eric and Christine and took them both to the hospital. Meanwhile, when John learned that Eric had been admitted to the hospital, he immediately set out to kill him. Across the entire city, people began saying that Eric was the reincarnation of Thor because, just like Thor, he possessed the power to summon and control lightning. At the hospital, the doctors decided to perform several tests on Eric so they could discover where his extraordinary powers had come from. However, Eric became frightened once again, and powerful waves of electricity suddenly burst out of his body, destroying all the medical equipment in an instant. As a result, the treatment of a young child was interrupted, and the child suffered a heart attack and died. When Eric found out what had happened, he was overwhelmed with guilt and immediately rushed to help the child. But before he could even reach the child's room, John confronted him and pointed a gun directly at him. John wanted to avenge the death of his son. Hearing this, Eric apologized to him and said that if killing him would bring John peace, then he was willing to accept it. But at that moment, the child needed Eric's help. Hearing those words, even John's heart softened, and he gave up his intention of killing Eric. Eric immediately rushed into the child's room and placed his hand on the child's chest. Then, a mysterious magical power flowed out of him, and suddenly the child came back to life. Not only that, but the child's entire illness was completely cured. After witnessing all of this, Henrik became convinced that Eric could not possibly be a bad person. He decided to help Eric solve the mystery of where these incredible powers had come from. Henrik then set out with Eric and Christine for the same farm where Eric's relatives had once lived. However, as soon as Eric stepped outside the hospital, hundreds of people had already gathered there, eagerly waiting just to catch a glimpse of him. Believing him to be the reincarnation of Thor, they applauded and cheered for him. But Eric was afraid that he might accidentally hurt someone in the crowd because of his powers. Eventually they got into the car and drove away. During the journey, Henrik handed Christine a book about the Norse gods. It stated that after the death of Ragnarok, Thor's children had settled on a farm, and that this might be the very same farm where Eric's relatives had lived. If that turned out to be true, it would mean that Eric was a descendant of Thor, the god of thunder. Finally, when they reached the farm, Eric suddenly dropped to his knees. Henrik then called in workers and had them begin excavating the land. However, none of them knew that Hathaway had already surrounded the entire farm with military forces. Hathaway ordered her soldiers that if Eric made even the slightest suspicious move, they were to shoot him immediately. The excavation continued for quite some time, and eventually they discovered a series of ancient underground caves. Inside the caves were inscriptions telling the stories of the Norse gods. The writings revealed that after Ragnarok, Thor's descendants had come to Earth and settled there, and that their bloodline had continued to exist on Earth ever since. This finally confirmed that Eric was indeed one of Thor's descendants. At last, the time had come for Eric to enter the cave where Thor's legendary weapon awaited him. When Eric reached the center of the cave, he discovered a chest containing a pair of gloves and a belt. Then at last he found Thor's famous hammer, Mjolnir. The moment Eric put on the gloves and the belt and took hold of Mjolnir, a tremendous bolt of lightning struck across the sky. From that moment onward, Eric was able to control the lightning through Thor's hammer. At last he had become the god of thunder. As soon as Eric emerged from the cave, thousands of people broke through the barricades and rushed toward him, desperate to witness Thor and his magical hammer with their own eyes. Christine was the very first to run toward him because she was overjoyed that Eric had finally discovered the truth about who he really was. The people of the city also began looking at Eric with admiration and respect. But at that very moment, Hathaway gave the order from outside to shoot Eric. Instead, the bullet struck Christine directly, killing her instantly. Seeing this, Eric completely lost control of his anger. He began swinging Thor's hammer with immense force, causing unimaginably powerful lightning to crash across the sky. Terrified, people began fleeing in every direction, while some of them were even killed in the chaos. Eventually, news spread everywhere that the descendants of Thor had returned to Earth once again. The government declared Eric a terrorist, and with that the movie came to an end.